Hey guys, this video is for Core World for Standard 6.5. So here's the standard. Students will use case studies to identify the reach and implications of the Cold War for daily life, such as the Vietnam War, the Great Leap Forward, or the Berlin Wall. I have another video that you can watch that talks much more about the Vietnam War. This video today is going to focus much more on the Great Leap Forward in China and the falling of the Berlin Wall. So, Asia, 1954 to 1991, and I've got to tell you that I am leaning very heavily on this book, the book for AP World History for Skyline this year for this presentation. While Europe, Japan, and the Soviet Union were emerging from the chaos of World War II, China was likewise recovering from decades of civil war. The civil war that had been going on before World War II, the conflict between the democracy and its supporters and the Kuomintang and the communists, and of course, its devastating struggle against Japanese imperialism. You'll recall that Japan invaded the Manchuria region in the 1930s, invaded the Yellow River Valley in 1937, engaged in the rape of Nanking, one of the most atrocious of the things that happened during World War II in 1937. And China was doing so under the direction of the Chinese Communist Party and its leader, Mao Zedong, who had declared the People's Republic of China in 1949. In a longer term perspective, China's revolution represented the real beginning of that country's emergence from a century of imperialist humiliation and semi colonial rule, the development of a distinctive Chinese approach to modern development, and its return to a position of prominence on the global stage. As a communist country, China began its task of building socialism in a very different international environment than its Soviet counterpart had experienced. In 1917, Russian Bolsheviks faced a hostile capitalist world alone, while Chinese communists coming to power over 30 years later had an established Soviet Union as a friendly northern neighbor and an ally in the communist movement. Furthermore, Chinese revolutionaries had actually governed parts of their huge country for decades, gaining experience that new Soviet rulers had altogether lacked since they came to power so quickly. And the Chinese communists were firmly rooted in the rural areas and among the country's vast peasant population, while their Russian counterparts had found their support mainly in the cities. If these comparisons generally favored China in its effort to build socialism, in economic terms, that country faced even more daunting prospects than did the Soviet Union. China's literacy and modern education, as well as its transportation network, were likewise much less developed. Even more than the Soviets, Chinese communists had to build a modern society from the ground up. Initially, China sought to follow the Soviet model of socialist modernization, though with important variations. In sharp contrast to the Soviet experience, the collectivization of agriculture in China during the 1950s was generally a peaceful process, owing much to the close relationship between the Chinese Communist Party and the peasantry that had been established during 3 decades of struggle. China, however, pushed collectivization even further than the Soviet Union did, particularly in huge people's communes during the Great Leap Forward in the late 1950s. It was an effort to mobilize China's enormous population for rapid development and at the same time to move forward a more fully communist society with an even greater degree of social inequality and collective living. The Great Leap Forward was a second 5 year plan implemented by Mao Zedong in 1958. Mao's plan called for simultaneous growth in both agriculture and in industry. To achieve his goal, the nation was organized into communes. There was no private ownership in the communes, and all services like education and healthcare were provided by the state. Citizens were even encouraged to create backyard furnaces for steel production. Ultimately, the Great Leap Forward failed. The steel that they produced from these backyard furnaces was usually awful, and industrial goods broke, and crop failures eventually led to mass starvation, especially between 1958 and 1961. The failure of the Great Leap Forward caused Mao to step down from his role as the head of state, but he remained the party chairman. China's industrialization program was also modeled on the earlier Soviet experience, with an emphasis on large scale heavy industries, urban based factories, centralized planning by state and party authorities, and the development of women for the task of development, and the mobilization of women for the task of development. As in the Soviet Union, impressive economic growth followed, as did substantial migration to the cities and the emergence of a bureaucratic elite of planners, managers, scientists, and engineers. The following reveals some of the achievements, limitations, and tragedies of China's communist experience during the era of Mao Zedong. First of all, steel production went up from 1.3 million to 23 million tons. Coal production went up from 66 million to 448 million tons. Electric power went up from 7 million to 133 billion kilowatt hours. Fertilizer production went up from 0.2 million to 28 million tons. Cement production went up from 3 million to 49 million tons. Industrial workers went up from 3 million to 50 million. Scientists and technicians went up from 50,000 to 5 million. Mao didn't really believe that you needed like an education to be a doctor. So a lot of women just became these things called barefoot doctors that were posted to the countryside that were supposed to help with healthcare. There was about 1 million of them. Annual growth of industrial output was about 11%. The annual growth rate of agricultural output was about 2.3%. The total population in China went from 542 million people to about 1 billion people, so the population doubled. Average population growth per year was 2%. Per capita consumption of rural dwellers went from about 62 to 124 yuan annually. Yuan is Chinese currency. Per capita consumption of urban dwellers from 148 to 324 yuan annually, so quite a lot up. And overall life expectancy in China went from 35 to 65 years, a massive increase in life expectancy. However, this came at tremendous cost. The Chinese between 1949 and 1952 killed something like 1 to 3 million counter revolutionaries. They labeled and persecuted people they called rightists. In 1957, about 550,000. During the Great Leap Forward, around 30 million to 45 million people died from starvation. During the Cultural Revolution, Mao's second part of his most important time periods, 500,000 people killed and many, many, many more persecuted. Officials sent down to rural labor camps during the Cultural Revolution was like 3 million or more. And Mao thought that the city youth weren't learning the lessons that they needed to learn well enough. And so he had them sent to the countryside, about 17 million during the Cultural Revolution, 1967 to 1976. Of course, such figures are hotly debated. See these books for more information about the numbers. But I mean, in general, one can see massive increase in production in China during Mao's time, but at tremendous cost. Both countries, the Soviet Union and China, favored urban over rural areas and privileged and educated, technically trained elite over workers and peasants. Stalin in the Soviet Union and his successors largely accepted these inequalities, while Mao certainly did not. Rather, he launched recurrent efforts to combat these perhaps inevitable tendencies of any industrializing process and to revive and preserve the revolutionary spirit that had so animated the Communist Party during its long struggle for power. By the mid 1950s, Mao and some of his followers had become persuaded that the Soviet model of industrialization was leading China away from socialism and towards new forms of inequality, toward individualistic and careerist values, and toward an urban bias that favored the cities at the expense of the countryside. The Great Leap Forward marked Mao's first response to these distortions of Chinese socialism. It promoted small scale industrialization in the rural areas rather than focusing wholly on large enterprises in the cities. It tried to foster widespread and practical technological education for all rather than relying on a small elite of highly trained technical experts. And it envisaged an immediate transition to full communism in the people's communes rather than waiting for industrial development to provide the material basis for that transition. The Great Leap Forward, however, generated a national catastrophe and an unprecedented human tragedy that temporarily discredited Mao's radical socialistic views. Administrative chaos, disruption of marketing networks, and bad weather combined to produce a massive famine, the worst famine in human history, according to some scholars, that killed some 30 million people or more between 1959 and 1962, dwarfing the earlier Soviet famine and the Holodomor. Nonetheless, in the mid 1960s, Mao launched yet another campaign, the Great Proletariat Cultural Revolution, to combat the capitalist tendencies that he believed had penetrated even the highest ranks of the Communist Party itself. The Cultural Revolution also involved new efforts to bring healthcare and education to the countryside and to reinvigorate earlier attempts at rural industrialization under local rather than central control. In these ways, Mao struggled, though without great success, to overcome the inequalities associated with China's modern development and to create a model of socialist modernity quite distinct from that of the Soviet Union. During the Cultural Revolution that went on from 1967 to 1976, Mao sought to replace party leadership with members who were more faithful to him. He also wanted to make widespread changes to the cultural, educational, and healthcare systems of the nation. To achieve his goals, Mao enlisted people called the Red Guards, usually high school and university students that were organized into groups who sought out those who opposed Mao's goals. They had these little red books that they brought around with them everywhere that were full of Mao Zedong sayings. They destroyed pre communist artifacts, they burned books, and committed acts of violence, especially against teachers and school officials. So, a lot of China's thousands of years of history was destroyed in what they considered the old culture, and so on. China under Mao, like the Soviet Union under Stalin, found itself caught up in a gigantic search for enemies, beginning in the 1950s. In the Soviet Union, that process occurred under the clear control of state authorities. In China, however, it became much more public, escaping the control of the leadership, particularly during the most intense phase of the Cultural Revolution, which happened between 1966 and 1969. Convinced that many within the Communist Party had been seduced by capitalist values of self seeking and materialism, Mao called for rebellion against the Communist Party itself. Millions of young people responded and, organized as Red Guards, they set out to rid China of those who they said were taking the capitalist road. Following gigantic and ecstatic rallies in Beijing, they fanned out across the country and attacked local party and government officials, teachers, intellectuals, factory managers, and others that they defined as enemies. Many were sent down to the countryside for hard physical labor and to learn from the peasants. Others were humiliated, they were beaten, and sometimes they were even killed. Rival revolutionary groups soon began fighting with one another. Violence erupted throughout the country and civil war threatened China. Mao was forced eventually to call the military in to restore order and Communist Party control. Both the Soviet terror and the Chinese Cultural Revolution badly discredited the very idea of socialism and contributed to the ultimate collapse of the communist experiment by the end of the century. A parallel reform process unfolded quite differently in the USSR, the Soviet Union. Under the leadership of this guy here, Mikhail Gorbachev, beginning in the mid 1980s. Like Deng Xiaoping in China, who had championed economic liberalization, Gorbachev was committed to aggressively tackling the country's many problems: economic stagnation, a flourishing black market, public apathy, and cynicism about the Communist Party. His economic program, launched in 1987 and known as perestroika, or restructuring of the economy, paralleled aspects of the Chinese approach by freeing state enterprises from the heavy hand of government regulation, permitting small scale private businesses called cooperatives, offering opportunities for private farming, and cautiously welcoming foreign investments in joint enterprises. But in cultural and political affairs, Gorbachev moved far beyond Chinese reforms. His policy of glasnost, or what's called openness, now permitted an unprecedented range of cultural and economic and intellectual freedoms. In the late 1980s, glasnost hit the Soviet Union like a bomb. Newspapers and TV expose social pathologies, crime, prostitution, child abuse, suicide, elite corruption, and homelessness that previously had been presented solely as the products of capitalism. Like an excited boy reads a note from his girl, wrote one poet, that's how we read the papers today. Plays, poems, films, and novels that had long been buried in the drawer were now released to a public that virtually devoured them. Films broke the ban on nudity and explicit sex. Soviet history was also re examined as revelations of Stalin's crimes poured out of the media. The Bible and the Quran became much more publicly and widely available. Atheistic propaganda largely ceased, and thousands of churches and mosques were returned to believers and reopened for worship. And beyond glasnost lay democratization and a new parliament with real powers chosen in competitive elections. When those elections occurred in 1989, dozens of leading communists were rejected at the polls. In foreign affairs, Gorbachev moved to end the Cold War by making unilateral cuts in Soviet military forces, engaging in arms control negotiations with the United States, and refusing to intervene as communist governments in Eastern Europe were overthrown. But almost nothing worked out as Gorbachev had anticipated. Far from strengthening socialism and reviving a stagnant Soviet Union, the reforms led to its further weakening and collapse. In a dramatic contrast with China's booming economy, the Soviet Union spun into a sharp decline as its planned economy was dismantled before a functioning market based system could emerge. Inflation mounted, consumer goods were in short supply, and ration coupons reappeared. Many feared the loss of their jobs. Unlike Chinese peasants, few Soviet farmers were willing to risk the jump into private farming, and few foreign investors found the Soviet Union a tempting place to do business. Furthermore, the new freedoms provoked demands that went far beyond what Gorbachev had intended. A democracy movement of unofficial groups and parties now sprang to life, many of them seeking a full multi party democracy and a market based economy. They were joined by independent labor unions, which actually went on strike, something unheard of in the workers' state. Most corrosively, a multitude of nationalist movements used the new freedoms to insist on greater autonomy or even independence from the Soviet Union. In the face of these mounting demands, Gorbachev resolutely refused to use force to crush the protesters, another sharp contrast with the Chinese experience, where Deng Xiaoping had brought in the tanks in 1989 to put down demonstrations in Beijing. Events in Eastern Europe intersected with those in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev's reforms had lit a fuse in these Soviet satellites where communism had been imposed and had been maintained from outside. If the USSR could practice glasnost and hold competitive elections, then why not Eastern European countries as well? This ended up being the background for what's called the miracle year of 1989. Massive demonstrations, last minute efforts at reforms, the breaching of the Berlin Wall, the surfacing of new political groups, all of these and more overwhelmed the highly unpopular communist regimes of Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and Romania under Ceausescu, which were quickly swept away. So we're going to call the falling of the Berlin Wall demonstrated here basically a metaphor for the entire end of the Cold War, the ending of these communist regimes in Eastern Europe. This success then emboldened nationalists and Democrats in the Soviet Union. If communism had been overthrown in Eastern Europe, perhaps it could be overthrown in the USSR as well. Soviet conservatives and patriots, however, were outraged. To them, Gorbachev had stood idly by while the political gains of World War II, for which the Soviet Union had paid in rivers of blood, 25 million people were killed, vanished all before their eyes. For Soviet patriots, it was nothing less than treason. A brief and unsuccessful attempt to restore the old order through a military coup in August of 1991 triggered the end of the Soviet Union and its communist regime. From the wreckage, there emerged 15 new and independent states following the internal political divisions of the USSR. Arguably, the Soviet Union had collapsed less because of its multiple problems and more from the unexpected consequences of Gorbachev's efforts to address them. The Soviet collapse represented a unique phenomenon in the world of the late 20th century. Simultaneously, the world's largest state and its last territorial empire vanished. The world's first communist party disintegrated. A powerful command economy broke down. An official socialist ideology was repudiated. And a 45-year global struggle between East and the West ended, at least temporarily. In Europe, Germany was reunited and a number of former communist states joined NATO. So, for instance, some of the Baltic states, ending the division of the continent. At least for the moment, capitalism and democracy seem to triumph over socialism and authoritarian governments. In many places, the end of communism allowed simmering ethnic tensions to explode into open conflict. Beyond the disintegration of the Soviet Union, both Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia fragmented, Chechens in Russia, Abkhazians in Georgia, Russians in the Baltic states and Ukraine, Tibetans and Uyghurs in China. All of these minorities found themselves in opposition to the states in which they lived. So, implications for daily life, again, they were massive and huge and occurred all over the place, perhaps best seen with the Vietnam War, which you can see in a different video from me, the Great Leap Forward inside China, or the falling of the Berlin Wall, which we're going to use as a metaphor or a symbol for the collapse of communist regimes in Eastern Europe and the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's 6.5. Thank you for your time today. Have a good one.